Chapter 1. A house rebuilt from ashes on Long Island, along the banks of the Connecticut River, in a town now called Oakdale. There once stood one of the largest private homes ever built in the United States, 110 rooms spread across a 900-acre estate, commissioned by a man who had more money than almost anyone alive at the time. It was called Idle Hour, and its story does not end the way most Gilded Age mansions ended, torn down or handed to a museum. It ends with the very Vanderbilt who inherited it selling the place, within a single year of taking possession, for barely more than half of what an official appraisal said it was worth, to a buyer he had to go looking for, because by 1921 almost nobody in America wanted a 110-room house on Long Island anymore. This is the story of Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, a man who would go on to become one of the most accomplished amateur sportsmen in American history, and who also happened to be the Vanderbilt who let go of the family's last great Long Island palace for a fraction of what it cost to build. Chapter 2. William K. Vanderbilt builds his retreat. Idle Hour began in the 1870s, when William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt, bought roughly 900 acres along the Connecticut River and the Great South Bay and began building a country retreat away from the city. The first house, a lavish wooden structure of around 110 rooms designed under the direction of his wife Alva with the architect Richard Morris Hunt, was completed in the early 1880s. It burned to the ground on April 15, 1899, in a fire that broke out while William's son and the son's new bride were honeymooning inside it. The couple escaped unharmed, but the original Idle Hour was gone. William Kissam Vanderbilt did not treat the fire as a reason to scale back. He rebuilt Idle Hour on an even grander scale, this time in fireproof brick and stone, spending around $3 million on a new mansion designed by Hunt's sons and finished in 1901. Complete with a library, elaborate gardens, and enough guest wings to host the kind of parties the Vanderbilts had built a reputation on. For nearly 2 decades, Idle Hour stood as one of the crown jewels of the family's real estate, a Long Island counterpart to the mansions on Fifth Avenue and the cottages in Newport. Chapter 3. The Mother Behind the House. It is worth pausing on Alva Vanderbilt for a moment, because she shaped Idle Hour just as much as her husband did, and her own story shows exactly how differently the family's fortune could be spent depending on who was holding the checkbook. Alva directed the original design of Idle Hour alongside architect Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect she used to build the famous Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue and Marble House in Newport. And she was, by every account, the driving social force behind the family's rise into the very top tier of American high society during the 1880s. She and William Kissam Vanderbilt divorced in 1895, an almost unheard of step for a woman of her social standing at the time, and Alva went on to marry Oliver Belmont, spending the following years using her fortune to fund the women's suffrage movement rather than another mansion. Before the divorce, though, Alva had already arranged the marriage of her daughter, Harold's sister Consuelo Vanderbilt, to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a marriage that came with a settlement of roughly $2.5 million in railroad stock handed over to prop up the Duke's crumbling English estate at Blenheim Palace. Consuelo did not want the marriage, and by Alva's own later admission and testimony, she was essentially forced into it. It was annulled decades later, in 1926. That marriage, arranged the same year Idle Hour's rebuilt version was completed, shows the same family capable of 2 very different uses for its money within a single household, building an enormous fireproof mansion on Long Island on one hand, and shipping millions of dollars overseas to purchase a European title on the other. Chapter 4. The Son Who Inherited It. William Kissam Vanderbilt died in 1920, and in his will he left Idle Hour and its contents to his younger son, Harold Sterling Vanderbilt. Harold was, by any measure, one of the more capable members of his generation of the family. Educated at Harvard College and briefly at Harvard Law School, he had gone straight into the family business, joining the New York Central Railroad as a director, a position he would hold for decades. He was not a gambler, not a drinker who ran through an inheritance at the card table the way some of his Vanderbilt cousins did. He was, in fact, about to become one of the most decorated amateur sailors in American history, eventually winning the America's Cup 3 separate times in the 1930s aboard J-class yachts, and he would go on to reshape an entire card game, refining the scoring system of auction bridge into what the world now knows as contract bridge, an invention he came up with almost by accident during a cruise in 1925. Harold Vanderbilt was, in nearly every sense, a success story. And yet the very first major decision he had to make as an heir, what to do with his father's enormous Long Island estate, ended in a sale so far below its real value that estate lawyers would have called it a loss on paper the moment the ink dried. Chapter 5. What $3 million bought in 1901. It helps to understand exactly what Harold Vanderbilt was inheriting, because the scale of the rebuilt Idle Hour is easy to understate in the abstract. The second version of the mansion, completed in 1901, was designed by the architectural firm founded by the sons of Richard Morris Hunt, the same firm responsible for grand Gilded Age landmarks elsewhere in the country, and it replaced the original wooden structure with fireproof red brick and gray stone construction, specifically so the family would never again lose the house to a fire the way they had in 1899. Inside, the mansion held an enormous library, elaborate formal gardens laid out along the riverfront, and guest wings sized for the kind of house parties that regularly ran for entire weekends, all supported by the full domestic staff that any house of that scale required simply to keep functioning day to day. Later architectural work on the estate, some of it credited to the firm of Warren and Wetmore, added still more polish to a property that was, by any reasonable measure of the period, one of the most architecturally serious private residences ever built in the state of New York. None of that architectural pedigree, however, changed the underlying math Harold Vanderbilt faced the moment his father's estate went through probate barely 2 decades later. Chapter 6, A House Nobody Wanted. When William Kissam Vanderbilt's estate went through probate, Idlehour itself was formally appraised at $650,000, with its furnishings and contents valued at another $133,000 or so on top of that. Those numbers alone tell you something had already changed since the mansion was built 2 decades earlier for roughly $3 million in construction costs alone. A property that had cost that much to build was now being valued, for legal purposes, at barely a fifth of its construction price. Harold Vanderbilt did not rush to sell. According to the historical record, he had real difficulty finding a buyer at all, a 110-room mansion on 900 acres being, by 1920, an increasingly unusual thing for anyone to want to own and maintain. Running a house that size required a full domestic staff, heating for room after empty room, groundskeepers for the gardens, and property taxes on an estate most buyers had no practical use for. It was not a home anymore in any ordinary sense. It was an enormous, beautiful, extremely expensive obligation. Eventually, in 1921, Harold found a buyer willing to take it off his hands, a syndicate led by a man named Frank Elbridge Webb, who planned to convert the estate into a country club. The sale price was $460,521, well below even the estate's own appraised value, and nowhere close to what it had cost William Kissam Vanderbilt to build the place 2 decades before. Chapter 7, The Deal That Fell Apart Anyway. Even that discounted sale did not stick the way anyone expected. The country club syndicate that bought Idlehour from Harold Vanderbilt fell behind on its payments almost immediately, and by 1923, only 2 years after the purchase, the deal had collapsed entirely. The estate passed through a string of owners and uses over the following years that would have been unthinkable to the Vanderbilts who built it. At one point during the 1930s, the notorious Prohibition-era gangster Dutch Schultz reportedly used the property as a hideout. Around the same time, part of the grounds was converted into a bohemian artists' colony, with former farm buildings, pig pens, and corn cribs repurposed into painting and sculpture studios for a group calling itself the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians. A mansion built to host the grandest families in Gilded Age society was, within 2 decades of the fire that first destroyed it, hosting gangsters on the run and artists living out of converted barns. Harold Vanderbilt by then was thousands of miles away, winning yacht races and inventing a card game that would outlast the mansion's usefulness to his own family by nearly a century. Chapter 8. From Artists' Colony to College Campus. Idlehour eventually found a more stable purpose. In the 1960s, Adelphi College purchased the estate and the surrounding land to establish a satellite campus, and that campus grew into an independent institution called Dowling College, which operated out of the old Vanderbilt mansion for nearly 50 years. For a stretch of the 20th century, the house that Harold Vanderbilt had sold off as an unwanted burden actually found a second life as an educational institution, its ballrooms and libraries repurposed into classrooms and administrative offices. It could have ended there as a quiet success story about adaptive reuse. It did not. Dowling College ran into the same financial pressures that eventually catch up with almost every small private college: declining enrollment, mounting debt, and a failed search for a partner institution to keep it afloat. In 2016, after years of financial strain, Dowling's accreditation was revoked and the college closed its doors for good. The mansion that had been a family retreat, then a gangster's hideout, then an artist's colony, then a college campus was suddenly empty again, exactly the way it had been when Harold Vanderbilt struggled to unload it back in 1921. Chapter 9, Empty Again. In 2017, the closed campus was sold at bankruptcy auction for $26.1 million. First to an international investment firm, and later to other owners who took turns trying and failing to find a viable use for the site. The mansion has sat vacant since then, subject to repeated break-ins and vandalism serious enough that local officials in the town of Islip eventually boarded up its windows to keep people out. Preservation advocates in the area have spent years pushing for some form of public acquisition to protect the building for the future, while Suffolk County officials have explored, without yet completing, a deal that might finally secure the site permanently. As of the mid-2020s, Idle Hour remains on the market, one of the largest historic homes in the United States, sitting empty on Long Island in roughly the same condition of uncertainty. It faced exactly a century earlier, when the Vanderbilt heir who owned it could not find anyone willing to take it off his hands, at a price anywhere close to what it had cost to build. Chapter 10. The Vanderbilt who gave the next one away deliberately. There is one more twist worth knowing, because it shows that Harold Vanderbilt eventually learned something from watching Idle Hour's difficult history play out. Decades later, in 1963, he played a direct role in helping the Preservation Society of Newport County acquire Marble House, another of the family's great summer cottages in Rhode Island, ensuring that at least one of the Vanderbilt palaces would be protected and open to the public rather than left to decay or fall into the hands of buyers with no plan for it. Harold Vanderbilt was never a reckless heir. He built one of the most respected personal legacies of anyone in his generation of the family, as a yachtsman, as a railroad executive, and as the man who invented the modern version of one of the world's most popular card games. But the very first Vanderbilt estate that passed through his hands, the enormous Long Island house his father had rebuilt twice, in wood and then in fireproof stone, ended up sold for a fraction of its worth to a buyer who could not even keep up the payments, and it spent the following century drifting from gangsters to artists to college students to empty rooms behind boarded windows. Some fortunes are lost through recklessness. Idle Hour was lost simply because, by the time it reached the next generation, a 110-room mansion had already stopped being something anyone quite knew what to do with. Chapter 11. A family full of palaces, and nowhere near enough uses for them. Idle Hour was never an isolated case inside the Vanderbilt family, and understanding that is part of what makes Harold Vanderbilt's quick, discounted sale so revealing rather than simply unlucky. By the early 20th century, the extended Vanderbilt family had built an almost absurd number of oversized private homes across the Northeast, 10 separate mansions along Fifth Avenue in Manhattan alone, a string of so-called summer cottages in Newport, Rhode Island, including the Breakers and Marble House, a Beaux-Arts house up in Hyde Park, New York, and country estates on Long Island and along the Connecticut shore. All built within roughly 2 generations of each other. Almost none of these houses generated any income at all. They were pure cost, demanding full domestic staffs, coal and later oil for heating, groundskeepers, insurance, and property taxes year after year, with nothing coming back the other way. By the 1920s and 1930s, as income taxes rose and the fortune itself thinned out across a rapidly multiplying number of heirs, the family began shedding these properties one after another, not because any single Vanderbilt made one catastrophic decision, but because the underlying economics of owning a 100-room house had simply stopped making sense for anyone without an entire railroad's worth of income behind them. Harold Vanderbilt's difficulty finding a buyer for Idle Hour in 1920 and 1921 was an early instance of exactly this problem, arriving years before most of his cousins were forced to confront the same reality about their own Fifth Avenue mansions. Chapter 12. The man who won everywhere except at real estate. There is a certain irony in the fact that Harold Vanderbilt, of all the family's third generation, turned out to be one of its most genuinely accomplished members, and yet the first major inheritance decision of his life ended in a rushed, discounted sale of the family's largest remaining Long Island estate. After Idle Hour, Harold went on to serve for decades as a director of the New York Central Railroad, the very company his great-grandfather Cornelius Vanderbilt had built the family fortune around in the first place. He became Commodore of the New York Yacht Club, successfully defended the America's Cup 3 separate times through the 1930s aboard the J-class yachts Enterprise, Rainbow, and Ranger, and was later honored by the North American Yacht Racing Union for his contributions to the sport's competitive rules. In 1925, during a Caribbean cruise aboard the SS Finland, he refined the scoring system of an older card game called Auction Bridge into what the world now plays as Contract Bridge, a version so successful that it effectively replaced its predecessor worldwide within a few short years and made Vanderbilt one of the few members of his own family remembered today for something he actually built himself, rather than something he simply inherited. He served as president of the Board of Trustees of Vanderbilt University, the institution his great-grandfather had endowed with $1 million gift back in 1873, guiding it through the difficult and divisive years of racial integration during the 1950s and 1960s. Judged against nearly any measure available, Harold Vanderbilt was a serious, capable man who built genuine, lasting achievements in three completely separate fields. And yet none of that talent or discipline changed the basic economics waiting for him the moment his father's will handed him a 110-room mansion nobody particularly wanted to own. Chapter 13. The Lesson Sitting Behind Boarded Windows. What makes Idle Hour worth remembering today is not that a careless heir squandered it, because Harold Vanderbilt was arguably the opposite of careless in nearly every other part of his life. It is that even a capable, disciplined heir can be handed an asset that has already quietly turned from a status symbol into a liability, and there is often very little anyone can do about that shift once it has already happened. William Kissam Vanderbilt built Idle Hour twice, first in wood and then, after the 1899 fire, in fireproof brick and stone, spending roughly $3 million getting the second version right, at a moment when a Gilded Age fortune could absorb that kind of expense without a second thought. 2 decades later, his son inherited the same house valued for probate purposes at barely a fifth of what it had cost to build, and sold it within a year for even less than that reduced appraisal, to a buyer who could not even keep up the payments. From there, the mansion drifted through nearly every use imaginable: a failed country club, a reported gangster hideout, a bohemian artists' colony, a functioning college campus for almost 50 years, and finally an empty, boarded-up building sitting behind a decade of stalled sale negotiations. Every single owner along that chain inherited the exact same underlying problem Harold Vanderbilt faced in 1920, a magnificent building with no obvious economic purpose attached to it, and nearly every one of them eventually walked away from the same house for roughly the same reason. Somewhere in that repeating pattern is the real lesson of Idle Hour, better understood than most other Vanderbilt stories precisely because nobody involved in it was reckless. The house simply outlived the kind of fortune and the kind of society that had ever made sense of owning it in the first place.